have a few questions to begin with. Okay, so you don't need to answer these. They are there just to sort of, get the gray cells ticking over, as it were. Your starter for 10. There we go. Those of you who are not from these shores may not appreciate that, but Colin will, I'm sure. So here we go. Your starter for 10. Okay, what is a gospel? Which writer contributed most to the New Testament scriptures? Why is the arrangement of books in the New Testament somewhat problematic? Who wrote the most books in the New Testament? And that ever elusive question, was Luke a Jew or was he a Gentile? Well, there we go. Just some thoughts to be mulling over as we get into our session here this evening. And I'll give you some homework because I know you will be eagerly awaiting such. And it's quite simple. Just read through the book. And if you do that between now and next week, you will be greatly blessed. I am sure. And you can do it in one sitting. It really won't take terribly long. Probably even less than an episode of EastEnders, if that's still going on. I've no idea. But let's move on then onto more serious matters. Perhaps the first thing that we should note is that the Gospel of Luke is the first of 2 volumes. It is the only one of the 4 Gospels to have a sequel. Now, this is maybe not obvious in the way in which the books are generally arranged in our Bibles today, being separated from each other by the Gospel of John. But it's almost universally understood that Luke wrote both the Gospel that bears his name and also the book of Acts. And yes, if I was arranging the books in the New Testament, I'd probably put John first, simply because he begins with "in the beginning," and I'd certainly put Acts immediately following Luke. But they didn't ask me, did they? So there we go. That's why we're stuck with what we have. Now, we might ask ourselves the question, why is it almost universally understood that Luke wrote both the Gospel that bears his name and also the book of Acts? Well, if we turn to the very opening phrase of volume 2, which says that in the first book, O Theophilus, I've dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up, after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Now, the first book clearly refers to the Gospel of Luke. We'll say a little bit more about that in a little while. Well, we'll also say something at some other time as to how we can be quite sure that Luke wrote the book of Acts, at least about 99.3% sure. And if he wrote that, then he certainly wrote the Gospel that bears his name. Anyway, more of all of that another time. Notice here that Luke says in the beginning of volume 2, he speaks of all that Jesus began to do and teach whilst in the flesh. And that certainly is a reference to this first volume, the Gospel of Luke. And so by implication, the book of Acts contains all that Jesus continued to do and teach through his new community, his body on earth. So I am persuaded that we should see Jesus as being the central character of both volumes, even though we might understand him to be portrayed as the spirit of Jesus, or the Spirit of God within volume 2. But I'm persuaded that he's the central character of both volumes, and essentially both were written for the same purpose: to make known the life and teachings and acts of Jesus the Christ. Now, incidentally, and this is a little snippet that we'll throw in for free, the reason that there are 2 volumes may well be due to their length. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are each close to the normal maximum length for a Greek scroll. At least that's what Palmer tells us in his Acts and the ancient historical monograph. But enough of that for now. Now, although both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts may essentially have been written for the same purpose, and they certainly share significant common themes, there's no reason why they should necessarily, or why they should not, I should say, maybe necessarily be classed as 2 different types of literature. There's a very clear unity and continuity within the 2 volumes, but they are distinct as far as their character is concerned, or if you like the word that is used generally, they are of different genres. Yep. The Gospel of Luke is well, it's a gospel, and we'll say more of that in a moment, but they do certainly contain biographical material, but more than that, as we will see. And the book of Acts is essentially history. Some use the term historical monograph, which is the idea of history being told through a succession of interesting, action-packed, captivating stories. And we'll say more about that actually a little later in the year when we're planning to do volume 2. Did I say that already? If not, I've said it now, haven't I? There we go. But in both volumes, Jesus is the central character. And I think we certainly do well to bear that in mind. Now, ever since the second half of the last century, it's become increasingly common to discuss Luke Acts as a unit. Although this might be largely, at least partially, due to literary matters, there are some more significant theological reasons as to why they could and possibly should be treated as a unit. Luke Acts is, and this is a quote here from a chap called Robert Tannehill, more of him maybe another time, but he's writing in his book entitled The Narrative Unity of Luke Acts. He says Luke Acts is the longest and most complex narrative in the New Testament. It was written by an author of literary skill and rich imagination who had a complex vision of the significance of Jesus Christ and of the mission in which he is the central figure. This complex vision is presented in a unified literary work of 2 volumes. Now, there's a number of matters in that quote that we might want to pick apart a little bit, but be that as it may, this is the sort of general trend in thinking of these books. Carl Holliday, in his commentary on Acts, said that Acts is not a sequel conceived by Luke after completing his gospel, but a part of Luke's original literary vision. It was not an afterthought. Luke anticipates Acts, which presupposes Luke. And I think we might see how some of that is so, maybe even a little bit before the end of the evening. So, well, I think we do very well to think of these two together. Lee has suggested that Acts could be described as acts of the Holy Spirit, and the Gospel of Luke, the acts of Jesus, God the Son. Could be. I mean, we can look at it in all kinds of ways. Because of what Luke says at the beginning of Volume 2, when he speaks of the things that that Jesus began to do and teach, seems to suggest that Volume 2 is about what he continued to do and teach. And but certainly, some people like to call it acts of the Holy Spirit or what have you. We'll talk about some of those things maybe later in the year, perhaps. Now, did you know this, that as a unit, Luke Acts is the largest single part of the New Testament Scriptures? And I threw together a few charts that I thought might be moderately interesting, to some at least anyway. I mean, I thought they were okay. So take a look at these and do with them whatever you will. This is a very simple chart. You've probably got one of these hanging up in your living room, showing the New Testament Scripture word count book by book. Now, I didn't put the figures in there. If you want the figures, I'll give them to you, but I think they'll be about as useful as as something that isn't terribly useful. The Gospel of Luke is certainly the longest book in the New Testament, and we're going here with word count in the original, in the original language. Okay, and of course, recognizing whatever textual issues might be there. So the Gospel of Luke is the longest book in the New Testament Scriptures. I'll give you the word count on this: 19,482. And if you don't believe me, then you can count them after you've read them. Acts is the second longest, and then Matthew comes a very close third behind the book of Acts. Now, so that there is how the books are, how they sort of tally up in the length going all the way through. The next chart gives a comparative New Testament Scripture word count by author. Okay, so there we go. Now, this is jolly exciting. Well, at least marginally jolly exciting. Not only did Luke write the longest two books within the New Testament Scriptures, but he wrote more than any other single writer. And we've added up there all of the letters that Paul wrote. And even if you were to tag Hebrews onto there, which obviously Paul didn't write, but I mean, some like to think that, you're still going to come up with Luke as having written more than any other single author. And so that makes his contribution to the New Testament particularly significant. And I'm just going to throw a third chart in completely for free. This is a bonus, okay? This is a comparative word count by author, including now some volumes from the Hebrew Bible. We're going to include the Torah, the latter prophets, and the Psalms, okay? There we go. So, yeah, Moses, you knew he was going to come out on top. If we understand that Moses wrote the entirety of the Torah, we're not going to discuss that this evening. But second comes Luke, yeah, even longer than Jeremiah, and on and on and on. Okay, so there we go. And of course, we don't know who wrote all of the Psalms, so I've sort of bunch them all together there, even including the whole book of Psalms is certainly shorter than the complete writings of Luke, and with the understanding we really don't know who wrote the books of Samuel or Kings or Chronicles. You may have theories and ideas, and that's fine, but anyway, do with all of that whatever you will. We're going to take a look at Dr. Luke himself. For the purpose of this introduction, we're going to assume that Luke is indeed the author of the 2 volumes, and there's absolutely no reason to suggest otherwise, not unless you're one of these academic geeks who simply wants to sell another book. You know, you might propose some, you know, radical theory or what have you. I mean, isn't that why most academics write? Anyway, there we go. So the purpose of this introduction, we're going to assume that Luke is indeed the author of the 2 volumes, which are traditionally and virtually unanimously accredited to him. We're planning to look at volume 2 a little later in the year. Did I mention that? I think I did. And when we do that, we'll say maybe a little more about this. But what do we know of this chap? What do we know of Luke? Well, we know that he was a close companion of the Apostle Paul, by whom he is spoken of as being the beloved physician. Now, the word physician isn't one that we use very often, unless if we're talking about Luke. Generally speaking, we use the term doctor, which is why the NIV renders that phrase, our dear friend Luke the doctor, and the NL New Living Translation has Luke the beloved doctor. But for some reason, we get stuck with this idea of the physician or what have you. But he was a doctor, yeah. Maybe not necessarily your typical NHS GP, but he was a doctor. And he did doctorish things, presumably, which probably back in those days were generally pretty painful. But some have suggested that there is some more specialized medical language found within these volumes, sort of, you know, pointing more clearly at the idea that the writer was a doctor. But actually, this idea is disputed by just as many people these days. Now, there are instances where additional details are included, sort of more specific details are included concerning illnesses, you know, that not only did someone have a fever, but they had a very high fever and things of that nature. But then Luke in general is a pretty specific kind of chap in other areas too. But he certainly knew his medical stuff, and maybe we find hints of that in some of his writings. Now, one of the questions that is burning upon our minds at this moment is, was he a Jew or was he a Gentile? Well, it is generally believed that Luke was a Gentile, although this isn't absolutely certain. I'm just going to mention, Stephen has just commented here, fair to say he was a well-educated man, having that in common with Paul. I would say yes, in as much as they were both well-educated, but educated certainly in different fields. But they would have, you know, that certainly would have been one of those things that I'm sure bound them together. They were intelligent, well-educated, Luke particularly well-written, and we see that. And Luke chapter 1, verse 3 to Acts, verse, stay tuned, hold on to that thought. Put it on a shelf for the moment, Andy, and we'll take it off again a little bit later, okay? Now, this isn't the time or place to debate Luke's ethnicity, although if he was a Gentile, then he'd be the only non-Jewish writer of the New Testament Scriptures, at least. And because we don't know the identity of all of those who wrote the Hebrew Bible, we assume that they were likely all Jewish. Incidentally, and I might have shared this story with you, or some of you at any rate at some time in the past, but I find it a little amusing, so I'm going to just throw it in very briefly, concerning the idea that at least all of the other writers of the New Testament were Jewish. One of my children, and I can't remember which one, it varies from year to year, but one of my children in their RE class at school was set an essay with what I considered to be a rather poor title. This was many, many years ago, of course, when they were at school doing RE for A-level, I think it was. Anyway, the question or the essay title was, what would a good Jew do? Yes? Yes, I know you could think of a better way to word that, but that was what the title of it was. And so after a little bit of family consultation, the essay was begun with the sentence, "A good Jew would follow Jesus." Now, this is not what the RE teacher was looking for. They wanted things to do with the Sabbath and Passover and bar mitzvahs and whatever else, okay? So they were marked down on this, and I eagerly look forward to the next parent-teacher-pupil consultation evening, and I sat down rather excitedly, actually, in front of this RE teacher, and I raised the matter of this essay, and I said, I thought her comments were interesting, and that I said, Jesus, I said he was slightly Jewish, wasn't he? And of course she agreed with this, and I said, at least the majority of the writers of the New Testament were Jewish, weren't they? Yes, she said, yeah. And I said all of the first followers of Jesus, they were all Jewish, weren't they? Fulfilling the Jewish prophecies that had been made. And she said yes. I said, well, there we go. A good Jew would follow. Anyway, there we go. You understand. It was a very good humored conversation. Okay, so there we go. If ever anybody asks you to write an essay with that subject, at least you've got a starting line. Okay, now let's move on from here because I want to share with you a little bit of ancient text here. Well, translated into English because otherwise I imagine probably none of us might understand it. This is a piece of writing which comes out of the middle of the 2nd century AD, of course. And it is known as the, don't lose any sleep over this, but it's known as the anti-Marcionite prologue to the 3rd Gospel, okay? Everybody's favorite bedtime reading. Now, to explain a little bit about this anti-Marcionite bit, there was a chap called Marcion who was a wealthy Christian ship owner from Sinope on the Black Sea. It's okay, he wasn't Russian, but Marcion was excommunicated in July of the year AD 144. Don't need to remember that, but he was excommunicated by leaders of the Christian community in Rome over rather strange teachings which had likely been influenced by a brand of Gnosticism. I mean, among other things, he insisted that all reference to Jews, to Israel, should be removed from the New Testament. I mean, that's your book of Hebrews out for starters, okay? But a lot of other bits were, he threw anyway. To cut a very long story short, because I just saying all of that. There was a prologue written in the middle of the 2nd century that was specifically against Marcion and his teachings. But there was a real need to deal with what had become a significant controversy, heresy among believers at that time. So, and I want to read. They're going to read this to you. You're going to be very disappointed now. I built it up, haven't I? And then you're going to read it and think, oh, is that it? Okay, well then here it is. Okay, because it gives us a very early insight into Luke, and if what is said is true, and there's good reason to believe that it is true, then it helps us a great deal in understanding how these early believers thought. Here we go. Luke was an Antiochian of Syria. That means he came from Antioch. You got that, didn't you? Okay. Luke was an Antiochian of Syria, a physician by profession. He was a disciple of the apostles and later accompanied Paul until the latter's martyrdom. He served the Lord without distraction, having neither wife nor children, and at the age of 84, he fell asleep. Of course, he did so euphemistically, meaning that he died. Incidentally, this idea that he was a disciple of the apostles, of course, he was a disciple of Jesus. You know, we should be the disciple of no other man. But the idea, he was a student of them. He studied under them, and we know. And he goes on to say, and I'm giving you the abbreviated version here. In his prologue, he makes this, but that is in Luke's prologue, and we're going to come on to that shortly. In his prologue, he makes this point he makes this very point clear, that other gospels had been written before his, and that it was necessary to expound to the Gentile believers the accurate account of the divine dispensation, so that they should not be perverted by Jewish fables, nor be deceived by heretical and vain imaginations, and thus err from the truth. Well, that's jolly useful, isn't it? I mean, it gives us some very early insight into Luke, who he was, and what was understood at that time as being at least the reason for his writing. So yeah, I think that's and this is part of the abundant evidence which verifies Luke as being the author of the Gospel of Luke. The next question, though, that we need to ask ourselves is, what is a gospel? Now, this, of course, would be equally applicable to whichever of the Gospels we were looking at. I just thought it was useful to, to remind ourselves of these things. The word gospel comes from the Old English Godspiel, from God, meaning good, spiel, meaning news, a story. So you've already got it, haven't you? It's good news, and it certainly is. It is generally used to translate the Greek evangelion, which means good news. And for example, in Luke chapter 9 and verse 6, they departed, went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. The New Living Translation renders this: they began their circuit of the villages, preaching the good news and healing the sick. Now, there's probably some discussion to be had at some point or another as to whether the word gospel ought to be used, at least certainly in some contexts. But the word does seem to have become a technical term referring to the message and teaching of Jesus, and then to these four gospels as being the gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there we go. We call them the Gospels. We understand what we're talking about. They have their own particular style, as it were. But I suppose if we're talking to somebody who's not in on the lingo, and we're, inviting them to a gospel meeting, we'd probably be better off asking them if they'd be interested in coming along to hear a presentation on some good news. But do with that whatever you will. Incidentally, and this is another, we're throwing lots of freebies in tonight, aren't we? Luke, Luke does not use the noun for good news in his gospel, and he uses it only twice in Acts. What he does do, however, is to use a verb form of this phrase in the passage that we mentioned, and in the other 10 occurrences in this third gospel. He uses it 15 times in the book of Acts. But the verb form of this word is not just saying the good news, but it speaks of the spreading, the speaking, the enactment of good news. It makes it into a living, vibrant word, if you like. So such is Luke's choice of vocabulary. Now, at first glance, it would be easy to understand the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as simply being biographies of the life of Jesus. Now, there are examples of biographical literature throughout ancient history, so it might not be considered extraordinary to find biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. However, as biographies, they're generally considered to be rather incomplete. And so instead of seeing them as simply being biographies, although they may well, and of course do contain biographical material, they are far more than being simply biographies. In essence, they are a genre, a style of literature all by themselves. There's nothing else quite like them. And of course, bearing in mind the subject of the Gospels, Jesus, there's nothing else quite like him either. So we shouldn't be surprised to find such a unique phenomenon here. I. Howard Marshall refers to them as, oops, I'm sorry, there we go. And, oh, I'd forgotten I had that one up there as well. I. Howard Marshall refers to them as being theological biographies. That may, or then again, may not be useful. Darrell Bock, and this is in his shorter commentary, I think, says that a gospel is a theological narrative about Jesus Christ. It teaches its theology while recounting the events surrounding this most famous of lives. And I rather like that, because it's not simply conveying information about an individual and the life of that individual, but it is also, in doing this, conveying rather deep theological truths that we quite simply cannot afford to miss. Now, I suppose that what we understand the Gospels to be will determine how we read and present them. If we see them essentially as containing information about the doings and sayings of Jesus, then we might miss what they're really all about. On the other hand, if we understand that they are written not simply to provide information, but rather to lead us to faith and to greater faith, to bring us into life, then we'll see them much more than mere, as being much more than mere information about Jesus, but as being personal accounts of the one who came from God to give us life, and a personal accounts by those who loved him and by those who through their words continue to bear witness to him. And I think this is really a terribly important thing for us to sort of begin to get our heads around. We don't simply find information about Jesus. We are finding here words that are deliberately intended to bring about transformation in the lives of the readers. Now, we did briefly pop the question up a moment ago, why are there 4 Gospels? And I think that's a jolly good question. And I'm certainly not the first to ask that. The existence of 4 separate Gospel accounts is possibly something that we simply take for granted. But though we may not understand all the reasons for there being 4 separate documents, we can be certain that it was by design of the Spirit of God. It was no accident. The existence of 4 separate accounts further suggests that they were never simply about relating the facts, as it were, according to some scientific method. You know, that is the personal retelling of the stories by authors writing within different contexts suggests that the personal witness is part of the telling of the good news itself. Now, there are some, what I consider to be really rather important missional truths to this, in that God always communicated truth within the context of relationships. And today, truth is always most effectively communicated within the context of relationships. And we have that going on here within these very personal gospel accounts. If they were simply about relating facts, then surely one more complete account would have been sufficient. And we could have called it something like the authoritative biography of Jesus of Nazareth, all the facts you ever needed to know, or something like that. Yeah, but that's not what we've got. It's clear that we have at times the same event being relayed from different perspectives. Various details are included or excluded according to the author's preference, according to their context, according to their, particular purpose in writing. Now, it's true that from early times there have been attempts to produce harmonies of the Gospels. And I think, Ken, if I look on your shelf, I think I can see a harmony of the Gospel somewhere. I'm sure there must be one somewhere there. I mean, they have been, a number of them have been. The earliest one to have been written was by a chap called Tatian, and it's a we don't have time to go into it, but it's a fascinating document known as Tatian's Diatessaron. The word diatessaron literally means like a harmony of the 4, and that's essentially what he did. Fascinating document. But if you've ever tried to harmonize the gospel accounts, you will know that there are some events which are simply impossible to know the order in which they occurred. And so evidently, this is not always a matter of importance. And again, points us away from the notion of being mere biography. There's something else going on here, as it were. And of course, we, generally speaking, maybe that's an overgeneralization, but generally speaking, I think within the Western world, we're a little more obsessed with things like chronology and timekeeping than they were back in the world in which they were living So the existence of 4 separate gospel accounts itself tells us something of how they're to be understood. We've got to be careful in our studies to allow them to say what the respective authors wished them to say. And then we should seek, of course, to understand what is the message and the message for us, and how might we best relate that message to our contemporaries today. So in this short study, we're going to focus on the message of Luke. We may occasionally make reference to other writers, but our focus is going to be on the writings of Luke. Now, maybe some might find that a little frustrating. You know, we come to an incident and it's recorded by, you know, all 4 gospel writers. And there's the temptation to say, oh, yes, but if we go over here, we find this extra bit of information. And if we go over there, we find another little bit of information, and we put it all together and we get the full picture. No, we don't. No. What we do is we get a bit of a mishmash, and we're not getting the picture that the artist painted. So we're going to focus on the writings of Luke, okay? And forgive me for such an obsession. Okay, now it makes sense, I think it makes sense for us to first of all ask Luke, why did you write what you wrote? And he would probably say, well, why don't you read what I said about it? He would point us immediately to his prologue. And he would say, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Well, there you go. You've got it in a nutshell, as they say. Well, we need to say a little bit about some of what Luke has to say here. We'll say firstly that Luke is the only gospel writer to include a prologue to his work. And the others don't do that. Edwards, he wrote the Luke commentary in the Pillar series. He said the prologue of the 3rd gospel is the most important testimony in the 1st century to the prehistory of the gospels, and it offers unique insight into Luke's craft as author and evangelist. Sometimes you'll find when reading that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are spoken of as, you know, the 4 evangelists. Do with that whatever you will. But yes, it is a very important witness that Luke presents us with here to the prehistory of the Gospels. And a little bit of what's going on in his thinking, in his mind, this terribly well-educated chap that he was. So we might ask, what does the prologue tell us? Yeah, well, what does it tell us? Well, he's began here by saying, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So this is the subject of the account, the actual events which we understand to have been fulfilled through Jesus the Christ. That is the subject of what we are going to be reading. And And you may recall how that, as we mentioned earlier, at the beginning of volume 2, he says in the first book, O Theophilus, I've dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. So we take that, and Luke will say, yeah, this is about what he began to do and teach. These are the things that have been accomplished among us. Now, the opening comment, and we're not going to look at this really, where he says, as many have undertaken to compile a narrative. It is very clear that Luke is making use of material, written documents to which we no longer have access. This is all a part of his research. And we don't need the documents to which he had access, because we've got all the best bits here in the Gospel of Luke, and we've got them as directed, as led by the Spirit of God himself. Now, he said, a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And this suggests that Luke was not an eyewitness. Unlike Matthew and John, writers of 2 of the other Gospels, and we don't know about Mark. He may or may not, that's by the by, but Luke was evidently not an eyewitness. And that phrase that he used there, ministers of the word, does that remind you of a phrase that he uses in the book of Acts in chapter 6, when they're about to choose the 7 men there following the dispute concerning the apostles said that that they should devote their time to prayer and the service or the ministry of the word. So it would seem likely that here Luke is specifically making reference to the apostles as having been eyewitnesses from the beginning, which again is a similar idea to that which we find at the beginning of the book of Acts, where they're looking for the replacement for Judas, and they're looking at one who had been there from the beginning. So we have these ideas, these thoughts that are consistent here. He says in his prologue that in as much as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me, having followed all these things closely for some time past. And here we get the idea that Luke certainly is a scholar. He's a research scholar. He has been sat at his desk maybe for many sleepless nights, surrounded by papyri and parchments containing all of these things, possibly also notes, I say possibly, almost certainly notes that he must have taken from countless interviews with all sorts of people. What a delightful chap he seems to be. Yes, though he then goes on to say, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account for you. Incidentally, that word orderly is used in very similar way in Acts chapter 11, where he says that Peter began and explained it to them in order. In other words, here is a thorough and orderly presentation of the facts, of the events that took place. Now, this does not necessarily imply a chronological order, but rather that his work has been thoroughly researched and can be considered completely reliable. And of course, we understand that the Spirit of God has been most active in this endeavor. Then we come very briefly to mention of Theophilus. There was a comment a little bit earlier. I sort of, there we go. I think it's the one that didn't you put this on a shelf, Andy? Luke chapter 1, Acts 1. So I think you were drawing to our attention the presence of Theophilus at the beginning of both accounts, and so well you might. Unfortunately, we know nothing of this gentleman other than he was most likely a Gentile believer, for he had been taught, Luke tells us. Some suggest that he may possibly have been Luke's benefactor. And we don't know this. It's a suggestion. It's a plausible suggestion that he helped to finance Luke in his in his work. That sort of thing did happen and might have happened, but we don't know. But he wanted to present this. He wanted to prepare this for you, most excellent Theophilus. Either that's a specific title, or he's just simply being respectful. We really don't know. So that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Here's the reason for writing. Not only for the benefit of good old Theophilus, but also for our benefit, that we may have certainty concerning the things that we have been taught. And that would surely lie as the reason behind the writing of both of these volumes. Well, beyond this introduction from Luke himself, there are a number of significant themes which permeate the gospel and which, must surely have been central to his purposes in writing, even if he didn't necessarily begin by saying these themes are, significant. We can tell that they are because they permeate the text. One of them is the plan of God, very significant in both of these volumes. And you might want to be looking out for this as we make our way through the book. Look out for an emerging pattern of promise and fulfillment. Look out for phrases such as "it is necessary," and look out for the word must. For example, remember when Jesus had not gone back with as a lad, although he was considered, to be almost an adult by this time, that he was left behind. Well, he left himself behind in the temple. Parents came looking for him, and he said, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" There is deliberation about that. There is the idea of purpose about that this is something that he must do, that he did. So look out for the plan of God. We'll throw pointers at these things as we go along. Another significant theme is the arrival of salvation as a fulfillment of the promises of God. And we'll say something about that idea of salvation and how that too often we've narrowed that idea down to sort of almost serve some kind of legal definition. We'll say more of that as we go on. The universality of the gospel. The inclusion of the marginalized. Luke loves the underdog, and for that reason, we love Luke, okay, because he's got our back, so to speak. Yep, and of course he does that because Jesus loves all. So the universality of the gospel, and that kind of leads into the next couple that I want to bring up here before we conclude our time together this evening. There are hints of a new community of believers. There we go. And this is going to be developed much more in volume 2, as also is the inclusion of the Gentiles. But that theme runs throughout the gospel and certainly continues, developed much more fully in the second volume. And let me conclude by sharing a couple of sentences here from Bock, to whom we referred earlier, when he says that the gospel explains what a vibrant disciple looks like and how a believer lives in the larger, often hostile world. We see how Jesus lived in the midst of a world that does not understand God. I had a brief conversation earlier with a devout Muslim chap who was telling me briefly about his pilgrimage to Mecca, and how that just as within the so-called, Christian world, so also within the Islamic world, there are many that wear the name, or, many that would call themselves Muslims, as there are many who call themselves Christians, but it's no more than a name. It doesn't affect the life that they live. This fellow was a very devout Muslim, and for whatever that's worth, do with it as you will. But certainly we must understand, and this is something that we cannot avoid seeing from Luke's writing, that if we're going to be a disciple of Jesus, well, we need to take that seriously. It's going to make a significant difference to the way that we live our lives. And we see that lived out no more fully than in the life of the Master himself. We're going to see how he lived in the midst of a world that didn't understand God, that is so often hostile, like the world in which we're living today. And I'm persuaded that that this book over and over again will bless us abundantly. So thank you for joining us as we begin this little journey through the Gospel of Luke.